All right. It looks like we're all set. Thanks, everyone. My name's Katie Walsh. If we haven't met yet, I'm from MathSpace and run Impact and Partnerships here. And we're so excited to bring today's guest to you to discuss a very timely topic. Technology in schools post-pandemic. Where do we go from here? So as you can imagine, there's a lot we could cover. Excited to see where today's Q&A leads. Before we dive in and before I pass the mic over, I did just want to highlight the structure of today's event is this Q&A interactive on Slido. Again, you can use your phone for the QR code. Even if you're watching after the fact, we'll keep the question bank live and you can, all right, technical difficulties, always humbling. And you can add your questions there, upvote them, let us know what you would like to hear more about. Some of you have asked if today's session would discuss MathSpace. Though this is sponsored by MathSpace, today's event is more about growth, continual learning, and having meaningful discussion with educators from various backgrounds. We're excited just to hold space for a discussion around technology, but if you would like to learn more about MathSpace, our digital mathematics teaching and learning platform, I'll share those contact emails with you in a follow-up email, and we'll talk a little bit about it at the very end of today's chat. But without further ado, I'll be honest, I had to make a slide to try to capture some of the background highlights of our speakers. And this is just surface level, drop in the bucket. I could have used several pages to talk about each of you, but I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Kecia Ray in Tennessee at the TSBA conference back in November. And after hearing her speak to district leaders in Tennessee, I thought, I'd like to get to know her and maybe we could, share her voice more loudly. So past president of ISTE Board of Directors, Technology Research at Vanderbilt and Johns Hopkins, named top 10 EdTech leader by Tech and Learning magazine, among many other recognitions. So thanks for being here, Kecia. We have Dr. Frances Gipson with us today, professor in the School of Educational Studies at Claremont Graduate University, also director of the Urban Leadership Program, and former chief academic officer in Los Angeles Unified School District. So thanks, Donna, for being here. Dr. Donna Wright is our third panelist, tuning in from Tennessee, former superintendent of the year, at least 4 times that I saw, maybe more, Wilson County Schools in Lebanon, Tennessee, and recognized 3 consecutive years by the Center for Digital Education and the National Board of Association for Innovative Use of Technology under her leadership. So bringing some really interesting perspectives to all of you today. And with that being said, I'm going to mute my microphone and pass this conversation over to Dr. Kecia Ray. So thanks, Kecia, over to you.
Okay, thanks. And thanks so much for helping make this conversation possible, Katie and MathSpace. We, Donna, Frances, and I get the opportunity to chat frequently about kind of what's going on in the universe today. And I use the word universe because once upon a time, it was just like your region, your state, your area. And now it seems like with this incredible pandemic that we've had, the world literally is flat. We're all kind of starting from one space. So I thought it would be kind of cool to have to invite people into our conversation, the conversation that the 3 of us have frequently, and kind of get their insight and their feedback into this conversation. And then, of course, share some of the things that we've been talking about. So one thing that's weighed really heavy on our minds is, the past 3 years have probably been some of the most challenging years in education worldwide that we've ever experienced. And I think that one of the unique aspects of the past 3 years is, as I kind of mentioned a minute ago, the entire world was going through these challenges at the same time. And having been in technology since the 80s, which a little bit dates me, but I know some of the people in our audience have been there as long as I have, so I feel better already. This has been a dream come true. We are, we've kind of envisioned a day where technology has been more relevant in the education space than it has been historically. And I think that technology has kind of allowed many ministries and many districts in the state to rise to the occasion, so to speak. So I'm going to put our very first question out to my wonderful friends and colleagues, Francis and Donna, to get our conversation going. Y'all ready? So here's our question. What lessons have we learned? What have we learned over the past few years that we can put potentially into a long-term practice as we think about what schooling is going to look like going forward? Francis, you want to get us going?
I love that question. Thanks so much, Kecia and Donna. I'm excited to have this conversation with you, and thank you to MassSpace for creating this space for community to have this dialogue. Kecia and Donna know this, but I was asked to do a trend report for a philanthropist about the future of education. And I was so excited about it that I actually turned it into a PhD level course for superintendents. And over time, as we've gone through this pandemic, I'm like, yep, that happened. Yep, that happened. Yep, that happened. And I kind of started putting together this new framework or this way of thinking about this. So maybe for today's conversation, maybe write down like 5-letter R's. And we'll start with the first one, which is relationship. And while we've always known this, great system leaders like Margaret Wheatley, our heart and soul for so many of us, she had this powerful quote that just anchored me to this space today. It says, "It is possible to prepare for the future without knowing what it will be. The primary way to prepare for the unknown is to attend to the quality of our relationships and to how will we know and trust one another." So as we think about these futuristic orientations to leadership and the here and now, the R's that I think about is 1, relationships. Then I'm going to introduce 4 more and talk a little bit about them as we continue through our conversation. But the next one is really rethinking. What is it that we need to change in our own mindsets, all the way even from thinking about growth mindsets to inclusive mindsets? What is it that we need to recognize? What are the structures of schooling that we might think differently about? And then what do we have to remove? Clearly, there are some things that no longer need to be part of our nomenclature right now. Maybe we even need new language so that we can have new mindsets around our work. And then how do we resource that? And so just one thing to get us started in this rethinking space is when I put all those R's together, sometimes we get caught up on old language. So I'm just going to say, what might a modern learning perspective look like for our conversation today? And have that guide some of the ways that we think about strategies, resourcing, and again, going back to the relationships between all of these R's as well.
Yeah, and modern learning is a term that we've really leaned into during this time, because we believe we're not going to go back to what it used to be, and we were trying to change that anyway. So why would we want to? But we were trying to kind of figure out, well, what do we call where we're headed? So I think modern learning is a term Francis actually landed on and said, how about this? I'm like, that's perfect, because it's, it defines what we want to think about when we're thinking about learning, right? It needs to be up to date. It needs to be current. It needs to be modern. And we've certainly spent plenty of time in decades past in more antiquated processes of learning. So Donna, when you think about moving forward and especially just stepping out of your superintendent's role, which I know you were, phenomenal at it, but I'm super glad to see you on this side now, because I can't wait to see the impact you can have in this new role. But what do you think school districts and ministries of education need to be focusing on as we're establishing these modern learning environments?
We've all had this conversation, and including just Francis and with you as well. But the thing is that no one could have anticipated long-term implications as far as what we face going into a pandemic. Professional development had been really focused on it, and rightly so, but a lot of pride on the one-to-one initiatives. Now think about that, putting a device in every child's hand. And there was much energy, much conversation, much training. And then on the other side of that, we spent a lot of time as far as, and not just for teachers, but also for administrators, for leadership as well. And I don't want to say that it was superficial, but that was our world at the time, how to navigate the LMSs and and how to get in, and what you would see with a single sign-on. I mean, all that was the conversation, the discussion, the time, how to access resources, digital content as a supplement to where you would have even your text within the system. Assessment. I mean, that was the banner really of what we were seeing prior to. Well, we get into more than just a snow day or a catastrophic event. We're looking at something that we never would have known, again, long-term implications, and what we would do to really focus on, okay, now we have the devices, what do we do with them? And are we just taking the classroom and transforming it where it now becomes my kitchen and I'm going to teach us, a group of students? And so again, it gave us an opportunity not only to look at it and be innovative, take some risks, be creative, but also see as far as that as we move from this, that do we want to go back to where we were? I think of a good friend, that made the comment, in fact, brought it up with looking at maybe this is an opportunity once we get through the stress and where it places us, but looking at that's not going to be a matter of snapping the rubber band and moving us back to where we were, but looking forward thinking and the implications that not only what we learned, but the best practices that came out of this. And it's not to say that, as far as when we look at that ed tech training, but what can we do now that really will build that capacity beyond a device in every child's hand and being able, knowing how to turn the buttons on. I think Frances made a great comment the other day when we were even discussing this, that, learning management systems are great, but now that we're getting into that personalization, as far as that we need to look at EMSs, as far as how to scale that, but also make sure, and this is something that as educators across the country, we do just-in-time training many times without that forward thinking of as far as what are the implications, as far as, it's not going to be about snow days anymore. And maybe there was much that we learned in remote learning that was good, very good for some students and for many teachers. And that becomes that blending of what we can do as far as that going back into a traditional classroom with new thinking, but also what we can do to not only reach more students in the way that they learn, but also to capitalize on many teachers that thrived in that kind of environment. So again, I see it as a great opportunity, but we need to rethink as far as how we not only provide training, but also to encourage stepping out of that box and trying new things, because there was much that we did learn. And even with all the trauma, there were some good opportunities that came out of it.
You know what, my friend, you used one of my very favorite words, and that's blending, because we do know, at least, I believe that blended learning is like, if I've been quoted even that if there is a silver bullet in an instructional model, for an instructional model, blended learning's that silver bullet. And we actually have a study that was released during this time that was released. It's published in the International Journal of Education Development. And in this study, what they did is they modeled the long run learning impact of the COVID-19, what they call learning shock. And they were trying to determine what actions could be taken to mitigate risk. And what they found was remediation combined with long-term reorientation of curriculum to align with children's individual learning levels can fully mitigate the long-term learning loss impact due to the shock. And it can also surpass any kind of counterfactual impact for it for more than a year's worth of learning. So you can not only move them forward, but you can move them forward and beyond where you kind of anticipated moving them to. And that's blended learning. We have a lot of wonderful studies. The Christensen Institute has a ton published on their site that if you needed even more evidence than this, it's there. But I know you've done blended learning in your district. Francis, you've done, when you were in LA, blended learning was a big thing. So we called it remote because, and I just wrote an article on this. Remote was like our emergency pass to move to a distance format, but the true structure is, and the research-based structure is the blended model, the blended learning model. And we kind of leaned into the hybrid portion of that, but there's a whole continuum of it. And it does depend deeply on devices, but it depends on you using devices and kind of translating the access to that into instructional time. So Francis, I know you did a study on this, kind of a little bit related. It wasn't on blended learning, but I do think you concluded some things about devices and instructional time. Can you speak to that for just a second?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the frames of really rethinking and resourcing, some things that we might want to hold on to, they're both seems like technical and adaptive, the both and thinking in this space. So at a very technical level, I was engaged with COSIN, and we did a research study looking at, how was the internet being used during this time, and actually had some great actionable items for FCC to think about student connectivity. And some things that we found out is, students are learning in lots of different places. We've had the honor to be invited into these new learning settings with students and understand how they're learning, both in living rooms and unfortunately in fast food parking lots, but also in a vitamin N space out in nature. And that's changed the structure of how we've interacted with students. We also found that with that infrastructure, the device matters. And I think there was a longstanding idea that like, let's just hurry up and get that device out, as Donna was talking about, the one-to-one, which was really a technical thing. We could check that off the list. But then what was the quality of the connectivity? And then as we saw the quality of the connectivity, it ranged from the type of connections with students, the types of connections with teachers, the types of connections with resources, and also the amount of folks needing connectivity in the home, as many folks also became not only teachers, but employees in their home settings as well. So we learned a lot about that and how fluid that space was and how much more advocacy we also needed with our internet providers. A big adaptive piece of learning that came out of this, as we really dug into the data that I think is incredibly important for us to understand the narrative around this. You saw big school districts like Cleveland had some great studies that came out around what also counted for competency. What also counted for what many of us know about is mastery learning. And one of the lessons I learned from some colleagues in Colorado as we were really investigating this and was this, and I think this will stick with us for a long time. We've always known that the impact of the quality of teaching is incredibly important. But when you have limited time, the question is, how do you use that time? And we saw that in this environment. And what we found out is schools that were outliers, that really had great gains, here's what they did. Teachers planned together. They had dedicated time for that planning. They used platforms to collaborate on that planning and got really clear that if I've only got 2 hours to teach this concept, what would count for mastery and how would I make sure I'm incredibly intentional around this work? They also found that the way that they worked with assessments and understanding that continuum from kid watching to the more formative to the more summative type of work wasn't necessarily linear, but it was dynamical, and they could adjust in that moment. So what they found is these teachers, we talk about a toolbox in education all the time, but really what they needed was a tool belt, things that they could go to nimbly, deeply understand to meet the needs of all the ways that their students were learning, and whether they had language needs or students were thriving who before weren't thriving in special education settings, or we found students who needed different ways for the educators to set up their learning so that they could thrive. So we saw a variety of ways that teachers moved from the toolbox to the tool belt. And then what districts did as a result of all this data is they were also mindful that we might need a tool chest. So those of you who are engaged in multi-tiered system of supports, you also know you got to have some specialty tools out there that really help you understand what's happening for those students who are still really struggling, or folks who really talk about learning loss. At least they know the ways to really address learning acceleration and honor student voice in the process, that they know that their students are part of this team. So those are some of the big lessons learned, I think, across research and practice coming together in this space.
Oh, that's so awesome. I think I put the link to the study. You might want to check and make sure I put the right link in. But another thing that I think we learned, and you've talked about it, but Donna, you've experienced it, and that is it. Like, you experienced it during COVID, because that's when you were leading. Not only did Donna lead through a pandemic, but 2 of her schools were completely destroyed right before that from a tornado. So no wonder she was like, and I'm out. But
I waited a year though. I waited a year, but you know, and that's again.
Talk about the equity. That's what I need you to talk about. The equity gaps that were highlighted. You no doubt experienced them when the schools were obliterated, but then you have this pandemic coming in, and now that you've been so involved at the national level speaking on this. So what needs to be done? What can we do about that?
Well, and again, you know, I want to go back and preface it. There was no way that anyone could have anticipated or planned or prepared for what we were going to face for really 2 years. And, you know, we just had a little bit of a hiccup before, because again, 2 weeks before everything shut down with COVID, we did lose 2 schools that displaced 1,700 students, as well as devices that went up, I guess landed in Kansas somewhere. I mean, there was just so much that happened. And then 2 weeks, everything shuts down. And so again, what's the plan? You know, there was always great pride as far as those one-to-one devices, being able to get them out. But the things that, again, so different from a snow day, a flood day, whatever, no one knew what the long-term implications were. And so what it exposed was the glaring equity issues. Again, and it wasn't something that was unique to Middle Tennessee. This was something that my colleagues were experiencing across the nation. And part of it was that is having broadband access, which we all make the assumptions, and we do the surveys every year to make sure so we can get our dollars to see where we are. And, you know, we knew we had gaps, but what we also found out that many times how those questions were answered was more of a saving face and not acknowledging that they didn't have access, and found out that well over 30% of our district did not have access to broadband. So there was a problem there. Some families felt that as long as they had that phone, that gave them the capabilities that they would need. But, you know, if we were doing it streaming or anything that would really, you know, eat it up, or having multiple children in the home would, again, zap it. So there were so many complications and issues that we had to figure out how we could minimize the frustration, support the families, support the community. And so we became very, you know, putting that information out there as far as it was always a discovery, instead of having it turn into an issue, a problem, so that people would understand that this is what we're running up against. We need your help. And thank God, and I always put this out for our ed tech people, because they've been limited, because we've always restricted them by their funding, and don't go there because it doesn't support this or whatever it might be. But give it to them and say, okay, think this through for us, because we are in a crisis, and we've got to make sure not only do we capture our kids, but bring our families back in. And so we had 27, we had 25 at that point, but 27 schools at one time, and literally created hotspots that had a strong enough radius that not only would it be beneficial for students, for parents, but we opened it up to the community as well. And so those things that, again, that allowed us, that in a fairly affluent community, that we had some serious gaps as far as looking at equitable access. It also became very glaring that we had to start the meal deliveries, and people were surprised. And it was one of those things that no one was immune from what we were facing. The same thing that our employees also, again, and you had to be very sensitive to this, but many of our employees found out that they didn't have access because of where they lived. And we had teachers that were setting up what they called carport or driveway access that anyone that needed to could come to their house and, make it available. So again, when you look at what the discovery and lessons learned moving forward, there is no excuse in this country whatsoever that broadband is not something the same that is a telephone line. I liken it to what happened with TVA and many of the energy sources back in the 20s and 30s. Everyone's quality of life was dependent on having access to electricity. Well, that's where we are today. And that's something that I know you lobby, I lobby every time we have the opportunity, because we're still not there yet. And it's going to be something that's going to be necessary to make sure that all of our students have access and have the opportunities, because I don't see this, I do not see, and I certainly can't predict, but we need to be prepared for the next episode where if we have to transition home, that we do not have those glaring spots where we cannot provide access for every student and for every employee as well.
Donna, I'd love to just build on what you just said for a moment. There was a headline that I literally cut out of a newspaper and put in my office. It says, does 2020 present a crucible moment for K-12 education? And it says the answer may surprise you. And so just even thinking of those patterns, like you have Sputnik from 1958 with the National Defense Education Act, where we saw like new labs and innovation space. And that's actually where AP came from, advanced placement. And then when Chicago shut down in 1937 with the schools closed for 3 weeks, but that's when we saw the innovation in how we use radio and television, like PBS, which are technologies we ended up using in this remote environment. And it created new authorizations for new tools and methods in education. So I think you're exactly right that this is that crucible moment. But what's happened is we even have more stakeholders. We have community schools. We have parents who have realized the impact and have such empathy and care for our teachers. And we've also elevated, again, that student voice and that social emotional learning, not only for students, but for adults. So as we move from this nation at risk to this nation at hope type of mindset.
Yes, and that's a good way of putting it. And and some have been as dramatic, and I don't think that it's overstated or over. It's a new civil rights, because again, when you look at that access, whether it's looking at instruction or looking at access to appropriate and again, timely information, we need this. And we're still not there. And that's tragic in a country with the reputation that we have as far as innovative access and, again, forward thinking. And we're still struggling with that in the education arena.
But there's balance. So I do advocate a ton for access and equity in resources, but there's also this kind of tender balance. I've learned this balance more as a new mom than I ever knew it before. That is, is there such a thing as too much technology? Is there such a thing as not so much relying on? I think it's good to have there, but I do believe it needs to be monitored a little bit. And it is always shocking to me the things that my 2-year-old daughter can do on a phone or a device that she doesn't have them. She just finds them randomly around the house. And then she can, it's just so intuitive to her, so intuitive. So I do think there's a balance. So how much is too much when we're thinking about using technology? Like, what is the balance? What's the balance in the classroom? What's the balance at home? Because I do think a lot of parents are leaning to us to give them that answer, to kind of let them know what the balance is. I'll put some guidance out there that the Pediatric Association, by the way, has defined. But another kind of spinning with that, when we had the emergency pedagogy, and that is, I think, a term that Francis has coined and uses, but the emergency pedagogy that we leaned into, we did probably lean a little bit more into the technology than we should have. So how do we reel some of that back and make the balance?
Kecia, let me start with that too. Let me simply because that, again, there's so much information that's out there that really tying that too much use of technology being tied to schools. And I push back on that because, again, even during this time of pandemic and going into remote learning, when you look at how that was used skillfully by many teachers as far as going in and out of multiple platforms and watching how adaptive children are and being able to pick up and move, I mean, it was a joyful time to watch. But I think where you would find that balance is when children are not engaged as far as whether it's in classroom instruction or working one-on-one with teacher, when they're left to their own devices and it's unmonitored and there's, that oversight, particularly with our young children, that's where they become engaged maybe with too much time. And there's a lot of research there, particularly as far as everything from the cognitive growth. We can go all into that, but again, finding that balance. But again, there's been much criticism of particularly the classroom teachers that became a sort of a reliance or something that was a crutch, but that simply wasn't the case. And anything that I was witnessing or experiencing during that time, it became more than just a supplement. It was a great resource.
I'm also going to put in the chat, there is a study that says, to your point, that when it's used for educational purposes, when you're looking at screen time, there are a lot of studies around the effect of screen time, neurological effect, ADHD, all kinds of studies,
Right.
all kinds of studies. But when you are using technology for educational purposes, the impact is null. So there's no negative impact when you're using it for education. I'll slip that study link in there. Which,
in case you look at the things, even with the neuroscientists that are looking at, as far as the science of reading and looking at what happens with the brain, particularly with young children, again, as far as that connection. And again, we've learned to teach reading differently as well, based on the use of technology. So again, it goes back to your term, the balance.
Balance, right. Francis?
Maybe a balance lesson here. I'm going to pull my California card for a moment and ask everybody to take a deep breath in with me. Will you do that for a moment? All right, let's take a deep breath, everybody. Now, some of you are probably wondering, what is she up to? You took a deep breath in, and what did your body naturally want to do? Release it, breathe out. What you just demonstrated is the natural tension that Barry Johnson, social worker extraordinaire, titles a polarity. How do we simultaneously hold on to two seemingly opposing tensions? And so I think what's happening in a technology space is we're treating things as a problem to solve, something that has an absolute solution. But what it really is it's a tension to manage. Just like the tensions that we've managed through this pandemic and beyond, these are the leadership spaces that we find ourselves in. Like, how do you manage communication? How do you manage love? How do you manage care? How do you manage technology? It's like standing on one of those stability balls at the gym, right? Remember the gym, that place we used to be able to go to a lot? Well, if you stand on that stability ball and you seesaw too much, you use one polarizing tension more than the other, you actually fall off. So our job is to oscillate back and forth and reap the benefits of both. So stability and change, we need them both together, right? Because we want the innovation, but we also want to have the competency around knowing what to do. Right. So I think one of the tensions to remind ourselves of when it comes to balance is it's the both and thinking, not the either or thinking that really traps us in not having unlimited possibilities and abundance in our thinking.
So
There's
brilliant.
your balance, Kecia.
You see why I hang out with these ladies all the time. So amazing. Okay, so here is a loaded question, and it'd be cool if our audience could also post their response to this question too. And here it is. What would your freedom of dreaming be for education and the regulations they are held to?
Oh, don't get me started. And I mentioned this the other day, in very few states have not released as far as their grasp on this, but many of the rules and regulations that we are all bound by date back to the 20s and the 30s. There were some revisions as far as, looking at how we deliver, but that when you look at seat time, minutes, Carnegie units, all these pieces, attendance is based on, as far as that you get your funding. There's so much that really restricts what we can do and how we do without asking for forgiveness as opposed to permission. And if I had my wish is to go back and use this opportunity over the last 2 years, as far as what have we learned? And there's been a lot of good things. And I know that sometimes our memories become dim, but there were a lot of good things that we learned, particularly when you look at instruction, when you look at learning for many students that did not thrive in a typical traditional classroom, but they did while they were at home, where other students that needed that relationship and that building of capacity within a classroom, that were failing in that remote setting, but thrived when they came back into the classroom. There's so much, but the thing that we did find out, time and place. Is that something that we need to create policy for? Do we need to be able to give sort of a break the mold, attitude to see what we can do to not restrain, but to, again, that future forward thinking, particularly with teaching and learning. And so I hope this is something that our legislators and our boards of education across the country will give our schools the opportunity to rethink, reimagine. I like that word, reimagine. And I hope to see it in my lifetime.
Frances, what's your dream?
Well, I have lots of dreams, you know that. So maybe thinking about the sense of nestedness, I think at the federal level, we really have to look at that connectivity that we've all talked about, that this is a utility, that it's not a nice to have, it's a must have. And I think we need to really ensure that for all learners, and all learners meaning not only students in schools, but all of us as adults and in society. We've seen how important this is, and we've seen, national and international models around this. I think also, if I then go to the state level, I love what you said, Donna, and I know Kecia, you're a huge advocate around rethinking the seat time or the average daily attendance. I know our state superintendent is behind rethinking that, because we've seen different ways to evidence learning and also explore possibilities in that space. So I hope that more states take a look at what that really looks like, again, going back to that mastery, and remove some of those obstacles, right? There's been lots of changes in higher ed, and I think we can see that space in the early ed to 20 continuum. And then I think more at the local level, what I've been excited about is I've seen school boards, and also in alignment with state, to really understand the importance of schools being at the center of community. And with that construct, we're seeing more wellness centers. We're seeing more social emotional learning, not only for students and adults, we're also seeing it in the teacher credentialing. And we're understanding the role of trauma and how we need professional learning around that, our students don't just come to us with like, here's the instructional stuff you're going to learn today, but it's a whole child in a whole context, in a whole community. And there's ways that really can support that, from thinking about, again, trauma, SEL, but also, really quality standards for learning, and things that include things like the ISTE standards around the International Society for Technology and Education, around how are we global collaborators? How are we innovators? So I think about ways to operationalize that, put it in policy, and change mindsets and heart sets.
How pretty. I love it. And I mean, and I'm on the same bandwagon. I think that we, do we really need 5 days a week, 7.5 hours a day? And I think that some kids thrive in 100% virtual environments. I think some kids thrive in hybrid environments. And I think some kids thrive in face-to-face brick and mortar, some project-based, and having that flexibility. And, you have to have the word standardized in IT, but I really don't like it. So I feel like that personalized, really what we've written into ESSA and the National Tech Plan, but kind of seeing it to come to life as we kind of all intended it to when we were working on that legislation. One thing, one stat, and then we're going to move to Q&A for our beloved audience. One stat that came out in 2020, and it came out from the Christensen Institute, a survey that they did, stated that 70% of all districts now have learning management systems. And I can imagine that that number's gone up now in 2022. But the main reason that we think about learning management systems and quite frankly, software it's a new way to deliver our instruction. We have leaned into a lot of print-based materials, and I'm not dissing print-based materials, but I'm just saying it was hard during this last 3 years to use them. And so it's allowed us to pivot to more of a digital framework when we're thinking about curriculum and instructional delivery. So how has this shift in learning and this kind of dream that we have for the future, and I think it's going to become a reality for many, many districts and ministries, how has it shifted our outlook on software and how we purchase software, how we adopt it? Thinking about software, we've always thought about it as supplemental, but now it's kind of moving into core space. So let's have our last question kind of be around the practicalities of putting our vision into practice with software.
Kecia, let me start off with the LMSs, because I would really like Francis to talk about, again, moving to that EMS. And if you really think there's been so much discussion and so much to choose from when you look at those, LMSs, those learning management systems, and that many districts bought before they even knew what they were going to do with it, because it was the thing to do. And it was the idea that it would house everything and one-stop shopping, and teachers could go in and, it just this lovely platform. And many of them had to make multiple decisions because they didn't deliver or produce, and teachers found it very cumbersome. And the idea that, they would have access to district content, but without realizing that needed to be something that was embedded in that core curriculum. So there was so much loss based on these learning management systems until they started getting a little more sophisticated and realized what teachers needed, but not only teachers, but how students could access, and their parents. And so when you look at just the evolution, and that's what I've seen, particularly in the last 5 years, of where we were and where we are now and what's needed, there's been huge leaps. And again, now's the time for this perfect, I guess, rebirth of what it can provide, but with the idea that it gets elevated on district budgets as far as the why and what the need and what it can provide. But also, again, when you look how it could transform as far as even access for parents, not to just get in it, but to see what it would hold as far as that individualization for kids and what's being provided for their teachers. So I set the stage simply because there's been millions and millions of dollars that have been spent, and many districts have gone through it. They're now their second and third iteration, and it still is not fitting their needs. So what will that fourth iteration possibly be, and what it should look like? And Francis has got some really good thinking behind that as far as where we need to be. Go, Francis.
Donna, you're sharing the conversation that keeps me up at night. When I was in my former school district, I was always struggling, like, how do we, accelerate opportunities? And we rolled out one of the nation's largest LMS. And we also did some really incredibly innovative work around technology and making sure that data could be in the hands of our educators at the point of decision making. And I know, as a former superintendent, and I know you and Kecia live in that space, you have data in so many disparate places. We had found we had data in like 83 places. So we got all our data and the interoperability around that all cleaned up. But again, now you've got this LMS, you've got this great data system, and then you've got all these software and resources. So I finally sat across from a great innovator in the tech space, and I said, you know what, we don't need an LMS anymore. We need an EMS, an educator management system, where the best of everything is in one place so that you can drill down to that data. So teachers have all their software at point of use in ways that work for them. So they could do gaming, they can bring in artificial intelligence, they can bring in all of their data and really get to know their students. So like this digital backpack of their classroom is always with them, and also there for their students to help accelerate their learning. So I think we've moved beyond all these isolated pieces. And what the pandemic has really taught us is that we're a shape-shifting organization, and things have to be woven together with lots of different ways where we can pick up leadership and opportunity at any given point, but also know that there's a support network behind that. So I think that's what these types of possibilities do. And I love being part of this innovative team that's rethinking that space.
So Francis, how do these districts make the transition when they've already invested millions of dollars and they feel stuck with what they have, as opposed to be able to move in, again, consolidate, and if anything, for teacher efficiencies, because we've got to make it easier for them to be able to access. So how do they do that?
I think there's great organizations that are helping us think about the interoperability, the ways that those possibilities come together. Always happy to continue this conversation as well. I know our MassSpace colleagues have all of our contact information, but great partners who put out space for us to think about this, I think help us build this community. And then I know, knowing the three of us and the four of us on the screen and our interconnected communities joining us today, we can continue exploring those possibilities. But they can happen with the right partnerships and asking the right questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And giving yourself the right amount of time, which is what I'm trying to do on this webinar. So we are super thankful that we've been able to have our conversation. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Katie so she can close us out.
Yeah, thanks, Kecia. And thank you, all of you, for sharing your perspectives, insights. I know on my end, it was very thought-provoking, and watching the chat box as well as Slido, there have been some follow-up questions that have come through. So I'll go ahead and quickly share my screen so that we can dive into a couple of those. Let's see. First up, we have John's question. With digital technologies, connection to the internet, will physical boundaries of school districts continue? Would any of you like to weigh in on this one for us?
Well, I can, and that's something that's already started occurring. And in many states right now, as far as you're seeing consortiums of school districts, as far as sharing resources and access that for many, particularly small rural districts, would not have the ability to provide for their students. So you're already seeing that happening. And it was something that we were doing in Wilson County and continue to do. But I think what John might also be alluding to, as far as, does that mean that when you look at those physical boundaries, is that something that we would see maybe a universal school district as opposed to having the boundaries? I don't know. And I don't know that I would want to give an opinion on that right now, but good question, John.
All right, thank you, Donna. And for the sake of time, we'll go ahead and move on to the next question here. Harry, thanks for writing in. Students now seem to learn more from YouTube than from reading. How does this change how we teach? Bringing up another relevant topic among educators. Kecia,
I'll start, but I'm going to hand it over to Frances because she has the reading literacy expertise much greater than I. But the flipped learning is probably what I would say is a strategy that I lean into when you know your kids are going to be more attuned to resources that are on YouTube or Prime Video, or quite frankly, wherever they get it, and just take advantage of it. Use those resources, embed them in your lesson, and have your kids access that, but also you use your wonderful pedagogy and teach them the skills that they need to know in order to, have the best reading ability that they can have. So Frances, I'm going to turn it back.
Oh, I would definitely encourage everyone to take a look at the website that I put in a chat, the SOLD Alliance. There's been a lot of work. I've been personally involved with folks like Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond and the Learning Policy Institute, and they've created this SOLD Alliance, which looks at the science of learning development, which really helps us rethink some of the ways that we orient learning, especially in a way that understands the whole child, the brain research, and what we've learned from deeper learning practices. So check that out. Lots of interactive ways to think about how to answer this question and the research and practice behind it.
Great, thank you. And this question here we'll wrap up with parents, the parent community, very important, want to have a say in their child's use of technology. How do we balance school, home, the use of tech as school leaders?
Well, I addressed this earlier too. One thing that parents need to know, again, we can monitor, we can, dictate more or less as far as between the school and the child. But one of the things that parents need to be aware of what their kids are using, when they're using it, and whether they're 5 or 18. And that's a parent responsibility as far as what's happening with that use of technology at home, and have access that into whatever they're using. And I know that that's something that parents have reached out to us many, many times, wanting to know how they can manage that. Well, part of it's being the parent. And, you know, that seems very easy and cliche, but that's part of the problem right now. The parents have to take control as far as, and as long as that device is in their home, they need to control it.
Yeah, I think it's really hard and tempting when you're, especially when you're a young parent, starting out with a little kiddo. I see them all the time in grocery stores, handing them the phone. And then I see massive fits when you try to take that phone away. And when you start that as a 1 and 2 year old, it's kind of hard to undo. So it really starts before you ever even show up at a school. That behavior of wanting to have access to technologies that really we need to, you know, more than balance, but we need to manage. And I'm looking for the sheet on what that screen time looks like, but it's the Child and Adolescent Psychiatric Association has really great guidance on that. I'm gonna put that link in here in just a second.
I would also add, Kecia, I'll drop a link regarding this too. I sit on the board with the California Emerging Technology Fund. And one of the things that we do simultaneously while pushing on legislation is we have a whole school to home project where we make sure that when our students are receiving technology, it's really about the whole home and the school relationship. And how do we empower our parents and support them in the training, and even think about possibilities around, you know, college credit for our families. And so many of our families have been marginalized by technology, and we're inviting them in and saying, we're going to support you and hold your hands in this process.
And Francis, that's a good point. And I know we're running out of time, but that's something we did develop because of parent requests, a parent university, because we made assumptions that parents would know how to navigate and to help and support their children. And what we found out that we gave literally 3 levels of those that were going to be the novices, those that had rudimentary ideas, and those that would be expert in it, but found out that not only were parents coming in to get the lessons, but we also found out that many parents are using it to even upgrade their own personal skills for employment. And so again, we found a need by accident, but when we really empowered the parents as far as this is how you navigate, this is how you know, as far as looking at even passwords, something as simple as that, which again, we made assumptions that, you know, as adults, they would know how to do these things. But we learned a lot, and that parent university is still in existence today. And now they've graduated. And so we found out that we're having to make sure that we keep our parents as far as not only in tune, but you know, as they make requests, we've got to make sure that we're on top of it as well, because again, it became a family learning environment, not just the student.
Yeah. Thanks, Donna, for sharing that community of learners, all of us learning together, because technology in the home and in schools is something that we're learning as we go. So thank you so much again, Kecia, Francis, and Donna, for being here. And we'll be sure to share those follow-up resources, contact details, and a recording after we close. Feel free to send any follow-up questions that you might have for us, and we'll be happy to get in touch. So thank you all for joining us, and hope you have a great rest of your day, wherever you may be tuning in from. Thanks, everyone.